Welcome. Today we are discussing and reviewing the Pilot Custom 74. Now, the Pilot Custom 74 is the smaller cousin of the 742 or the 743, and as such has a smaller nib. If you like smaller sized, kind of thinner pens, this is definitely the one for you. Anyway, this particular one has a music nib. Let's zoom in so you can see that. This was my first music nib that I've ever used, and it was really fun. You can see this has a 14 gold carat number 5 size nib with some nice scroll work. Now if you notice here, you can actually see two lines or slits cut into the nib. So this actually gives two different places for the ink to flow. Now, this is not a flex nib and should not be used as such. This nib is used for another purpose, and that is really originally for music scores, and I'll show you what I mean. So here's an example of what a music nib is used for. It is used for very thin lines down, right? And so especially if you go up higher, thin lines down, and then thick lines out. So it's very stub, but it's for drawing like little musical notes. And you forgive me, I'm not used to drawing music notes too much. So, but you can see kind of our stub features, right? So it's a thicker downstroke and then a thinner cross stroke. So now let's compare this, right? So we'll do our So now we're going to compare the music nib. This is a 1.1 stub. Now let's look at a 1.5 stub. Alright, so here you can see the music nib versus a 1.1 stub and a 1.5 stub. You see it's very similar to a stub. It's got a thick downstroke and a thin cross stroke. I would say it's closer to the 1.1 stub, but the difference being those two slits that are cut into this nib really make it much more pleasant to use. The ink flows much more heavily when you apply the slightest, tiniest bit of pressure. And again, this is not a flex nib. This is not something that you do all the time. This is not something that is for people who are uncomfortable or unfamiliar with how much pressure is too much pressure, because you can ruin a nib. So you do have to know what you're doing when you're using a music nib, much more so than a 1.1 or 1.5 stub. So if you're just getting into fountain pens, I would probably recommend a regular stub before getting a music nib. But if you go down the rabbit hole and you find that you really do love stub nibs, definitely check out the music nib, because this one, like I said, that extra ink that's allowed to flow down really accentuates and highlights the qualities of the ink. Now I'm using Sailor Manyoka Nagi, and you can really see nicer sheen up here, and probably not in the camera right now, but there's nicer sheen up there that I can see, and you can definitely see the shading is much more intense than some of our other stubs. So that's kind of where I'm at. This is a really fun nib, and I would absolutely add a music nib to my collection. Speaking of, if you ever see people that leave the sticker on, this is kind of like the, you ever see people that have, baseball hats, but they don't bend the brim and they leave the stickers on? It's like a sign of authenticity, and, it's like keeping it in mint condition, so to speak. And that's pretty much what people do sometimes with Pilot pens. So that is why I am not taking this sticker off, because the person who lent this to me, the sponsor, to review, was kind enough to do so. So I'm certainly not going to go ripping off his stickers on him. So that is still there. This pen was really, really fun. I really particularly enjoyed the music nib. That was a star feature of this pen, and I would absolutely definitely buy a music nib in the future if I was looking for a nice stub that has more flow to highlight even more ink qualities. I don't write music. I'm not using this to write music, but I do love the nib regardless. Let's check out that nice little gold accent there. It's nice. You can see the feed there. And what else do we have? On the cap, we've got the Pilot insignia there engraved. The traditional, pretty much similar Pilot cap you see on a lot of their pens, that kind of ball design. And then down here, you can see made in Japan. Got 1 star and custom 74. Now let's do some size comparisons. Here we see it up against a Pilot Vanishing Point. You can see it's actually very similar in size to the Vanishing Point, and it's very similar in thickness. I would say the cap band is the same size as the body, but then the actual body of the Pilot Custom 74 is thinner than the body of the Vanishing Point. So you can see it up against Vanishing Point there. Let's look at a Homo sapiens. So here we have the Homo sapiens up against the Pilot 74. You can see the Homo sapiens is definitely girthier and bigger all around, but not too much more lengthy. Next up, aesthetics. While this pen doesn't beguile you with any sort of crazy colors or resins or depth to the pen itself, this is a very classy outlook, right? We've got black and gold. You could pull this out at a wedding. You could pull this out at a fancy business meeting, and you would look the part. This is kind of old school classy, but it doesn't necessarily draw the eye. And you can get it in any color you want as long as it's black. So if you're out for, crazy aesthetics, this is not the pen for you. If you want something that can look equally in place at a fancy ballroom or just kind of in a business meeting, this might be the pen for you. It's a little bit underspoken, but it has class. Next up, let's go under the hood again. Not super big on the fill system. So I'm used to more, fill systems, different mechanisms where I can just dip it in and do something up here and then have a filled converter. This you have to remove and then kind of eyedropper. So I'm not super big on the fill system. That said, for the space allotted, this is your most efficient fill system for maximum amount of ink. It doesn't take up any additional space with a mechanism. So given the constraints of a smaller pen, I could see why they kind of went with this more simplistic fill mechanism here. And it does hold a lot of ink and it's been very reliable, no issues. It's just not convenient to fill. The threading is perfectly fine and smooth, and that leads us into another part about Pilot. Pilot has immaculate quality control, especially as I've been branching out into other quote-unquote luxury brands like Magna Carta and Visconti. I can recognize that their quality control is not up to snuff here. It's not up. Pilot is in a world their own, I would say, as far as quality control. If you get a Pilot, you could take one of 100 Pilots off the shelf, and I can pretty much guarantee you that 99 of those would write exceptionally well without any problem and be exceptionally consistent. You cannot say that about many other brands. So when you get a Pilot, one of the things you're paying for is that exceptional quality control. It's the peace of mind knowing that your pen is going to work, it's going to work well, and you're not going to have to spend time going back and forth with customer service and getting replacements. So this Pilot 74 does come with that remarkable quality control. So overall, I really enjoyed this pen. This pen has remarkable quality control. It's got a remarkable nib. It is fancy enough that it can draw an eye. It still go kind of under the radar if you're at, some sort of fancy event. The black and gold is kind of a timeless classic. The nib, the music nib, is just amazing. That said, like we've talked about, you want to know what you're doing with a music nib so you can use it properly. But that said, this is a fantastic pen, and I would love to add one to my collection, or at least the nib. If I could get a pen with a music nib, I really enjoyed this nib. So thank you again for the channel sponsor who sent this in to review, and thank you for taking the time to watch this review. Please go ahead and leave your comments down below. Do you have this pen? Have you used a music nib? And let us know what you think. And also, if you've come this far, please do subscribe and leave a like. Maybe even share it with your friend. Maybe they'll come on the journey with us, because it's a great journey. And I'm just kind of exploring and finding all these things for the first time myself, and I'm happy to share my thoughts and have you along with me. So until next time, this has been Mike from Zen of the Pen. saying, may all your journeys lead to your own personal serenity.